All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Mr. Ippolito.
Hello, this is Mr. Han again.
And so today we just want to take a few minutes to talk about one of the four Mexican War primary sources. And that particular primary source is the poem, The Mexican War is on Behalf of Slavery. All the rest of the primary sources, I feel like they're pretty straightforward. I think they're pretty easy to understand. But this poem is the one of the four primary sources where I feel like students might need a little bit more help, and so I wanted to go ahead and just take a couple minutes on this. Mr. Hahn, before we go any further, I did want to just show the biography of James Russell Lowell. He is the poet who wrote this.
Right.
Um, he was, and I think it's important to note that he is from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the birthplace of my father, as a matter of
Oh,
fact. Yeah, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And um, and so I think where he is from makes a difference. I think that is the fact that he is from New England, the fact
mm-hmm.
that he is educated. I think that that's going to make a difference, and we'll talk about why that might make a difference as we get into the poem. So,
All right.
all right, Mr. Hahn. So let's just jump right in and get going here.
All right, let's do it.
All right. The title is "The Mexican War is on Behalf of Slavery." So right away, the title just comes right out, and it's like a gut punch. It's like I am telling you, I am taking a very clear stand on what I think the reason we're going into war. War is something throughout the history of the United States that people have always had an opinion on. Some people are for it, some people are against it. I think, Mr. Hahn, probably the last time that we saw a lot of very, very prominent, very vocal anti-war sentiment, I'm going to say, is probably the Vietnam War.
I'm going to disagree on that one, sir.
Okay.
Well, not really in a sense of. Okay, I should say you're half right on that one in my opinion.
Okay.
I'm not going to disrespect you by saying you're completely in the wrong, but um, I'd say the most anti-war sentiment was seen during the Vietnam War, but then the most recent example I do have to say would be the Iraq War. If you remember back in the day in 2003, when there was talks about going back into Iraq for round two, round one being the Gulf War,
Hmm.
there was all those there was everybody coming out saying that the Iraq in reminiscent of James Russell Lowell, there are people saying that the Iraq War is for oil. I think that's the most recent anti-war sentiment that I can think of,
I would
similar to
absolutely
this.
I would absolutely agree with you.
Hmm.
So I think this is something, if you wanted to talk about this at home with your family, I think it's definitely a good discussion point. I know that my dad actually served in Vietnam. We may have friends or family members who served in the Persian Gulf War, or in the Iraq War, in Afghanistan, a number of armed conflicts that we have had throughout our recent history around the world. So I think it's an important thing to keep in the back of our minds as we read this poem. Is there have there has always been protest against war, even popular wars, World War II, World War One, even more so World War II. I think most of the nation was in support of World War II, but there was still that very vocal minority that was
Hmm.
opposed to American involvement in any war. It doesn't matter. War is expensive, and war costs blood and treasure. People die in war, and it's expensive, and so you're always going to have those Americans who, and we have our freedom of speech, so we have that ability, that right to speak out if we're unhappy with U.S. policy, regardless of what it is. Okay, now that we've said that, let's go ahead and jump into the poem. The first stanza here. As for war, I call it murder. There you have it, plain and flat. I don't want to go no further than my testament for that. God has said so plump and fairly, it's as long as it is broad, and you've got to get up early if you want to take in God. Ah, so this first stanza, Mr. Hahn, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the first stanza.
It's pretty much straightforward. It seems like Mr. Lowell here is pretty much against war. He's calling it murder, plain and simple. And from his religious what's the word I'm looking for here? From his religious references, Testament, God, and so on and so forth. He's calling it an affront to. He's calling it an affront to Christianity. He's calling it an affront to God. It looks like.
Yes. Well, and I think it's a reflection of how much more religious the United States was. I think we definitely there were, I say, a higher percentage of people who were more deeply religious and
Mm-hmm.
religiously involved. I think religion, specifically Christianity, was a much bigger part of American culture back in the mid 1800s, than it is to us 150, 160, 170 years
Mm-hmm.
later. So
This is a time period where I believe it was the Bible that was still the best-selling book of all time.
I oh,
Yes.
I absolutely believe it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's jump into this second paragraph, or the second stanza, excuse me. What's the use of meetin' going every Sabbath wet or dry, if it's right to go a mowing fellow men like oats and rye? I don't know but what it's putty, training round in bobtail coats, but it's curious Christian duty, this here cutting folks' throats. So, Mr. Hunt, I want to get your thoughts in just a moment. But meet and going, I want to talk about meet and going right here, because meet and going, of course, Google Docs wants to correct it.
Mm-hmm.
Meeting, it should be meeting going. Um, Meet and going, it a lot of church going, especially that evangelical church going back in the mid 1800s, in instead of a traditional, what we might think of as church today, you go inside of a building, people sit down, they stand up, they say a prayer, there are blessings. Like there was, I think, in many churches in the mid 1800s, this is the period of what we call the Second Great Awakening,
Mm-hmm.
and we haven't even learned about that yet, but we are going to, after spring break, learn about the Second Great Awakening, where there is this revival of religious enthusiasm, and people are not only going to church buildings, but they are going to like outdoor services, these tent services, or a preacher would just stand on top of a fruit box out in an open field, and there would be these big these big church meetings. So
Mm-hmm.
when he talks about meeting going, I think that's what he's referring to, is a church meeting, and of course, every Sabbath, in most Christians, the Sabbath is Sunday,
Mm-hmm.
the day of rest, and the day to go to church. Um, so, Mr. Hahn, what are your thoughts? How do you interpret this particular stanza?
The way that I interpret this is Mr. Lowell is saying, what's the use of going to church on every Sunday, rain or shine, if it's well, if we're justifying, if we're making right, what was it? The murder of war. What was it? The second, no, the third and the fourth line right there in the stanza. If it's right to go a mow and fellow men like oats and rye, it's it's saying like why that oh god, I can't talk right now. It's explaining that men's lives, like human life, is being thrown away. So then, what's the point of going to church if they're if we're condoning this?
It's that farming reference. You're
Mm-hmm.
mowing human life down. You're mowing them down like as though you were cutting grass,
Mm-hmm.
or like you were harvesting oats or harvesting rye.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Putty is, you see down here at the bottom, juvenile or childish. So bobtail coats. So like, what's the? Here you are. You're getting dressed up to go to church on Sunday, and you're getting dressed up, and it's you know you're getting dressed up all fancy once a week, so that you can pretend to be a good Christian in his
Mm-hmm.
eyes, when in fact you are supporting the cutting of throats. You're supporting the murder of war. So and again, one of the Ten Commandments. Those of you familiar with the Christian faith, one of the Ten Commandments is "Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not
Mm-hmm.
commit murder." And so he's very plainly saying that war is murder, and you're a hypocrite if you call yourself a good Christian, but then you're also essentially supporting murder in this war here. All
Indeed.
right. Third stanza, they may talk of freedom's airy till they're purple in the face. It's a grand, great cemetery for the birthrights of our race. They just want this Californy so's to lug new slave states in, to abuse ye and to scorn ye, and to plunder ye like sin. Before you share your thoughts on this one, I find it curious, Mr. Hahn, that here is this man who is from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And if you've ever been to Massachusetts, you know that they talk like this. It's my Kennedy impersonation. That's my my Maya Quimby impersonation from The Simpsons. So if you are someone from the Northeast, you're someone from Massachusetts, you don't talk about meat and going and go a mowing and plunder and so I almost get the impression that he's making fun of a Southerner, right?
Like a
I,
parody, if you will.
I
Yes.
yes, I think it is. I think it is parody. I think he's making fun of the Southerners because it was mostly the Southern states who
Yeah.
were supporting the Mexican War. Because in his view, the reason why they want to have this war to begin with is so that there will be more land for slavery,
Hmm.
more Southern land. Because after all, the Mexican you know you just look at that map and you know that the Mexican cession is all land there in the South. And according to the Missouri Compromise, students may remember the Missouri Compromise, that 3630 line, anything
Hmm.
above that line, any new land that was added north of that line was going to be free from slavery. Everything south of that line was going to be open to slavery. And of course, most of that land was south of that 3630
Hmm.
boundary line. Any, what are your thoughts there on that stanza,
Well,
Mr. Hahn?
this stanza is pretty much straightforward. The first stanza is pretty much it's calling out the hypocrisy of calling America the birthplace of freedom, and what was it? It's the third and fourth line. It's a grand, great cemetery for the birthrights of our race. There are many people that died for that freedom, and then now, and then in the second half of that stanza, Mr. Lowell is saying that they just want California so as to, bring in new slave states, so that they're just gonna. Well, and then of course this ties into the whole balance, the precarious balance in the union of free states and slave states, so that there has to be an equal number, otherwise in Congress, well, the free states or the slave states, they might get one over on each other. So a lot. I think that ties into the thought process at the time that not that many, some people did not want to add more states into the union just because they didn't want to upset that balance. And it's
Mhm.
what was it? What was it? And that's one of those problems with that was one of the problems with slavery, that the precarious balance between the free states and slave states that would eventually be that would just continuously be kicked down the line. We'll take care of this at a later date, until it couldn't be kicked down the line any further, and then it eventually culminated into our Civil War. So, yeah.
Well, and I hope to students who are watching, I hope that you understand that everything that we're studying now, this is what we call the antebellum period.
Hmm.
Antebellum, I'll pull this up here. Antebellum it comes from the Latin ante, which means before, and bellum means war. So
Hmm.
antebellum. Oh, apparently
Oh, it's a
that's
film as
also
well.
it is also it's also a movie that is coming
Yeah.
out next month. But this is really the antebellum that we're talking about, right before the war.
Hmm.
This definition over here. So this is the time period that we're studying right now. The antebellum period is the time before the American Civil War. And so you should start thinking, as we read all this stuff and look at maps and look at all this conflict that is building up in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. You should be thinking, how are all of these pieces of the puzzle being put together as ultimately pushing our nation toward the Civil War?
Hmm.
And how is it that we're talking about war now against another country? This poem is about a war against Mexico, but pretty soon it's going to be Americans killing other Americans. And you look at the American Civil War, and in the American Civil War, more Americans died killing each other in the Civil War than in all other American wars combined.
Hmm.
And so really we have to try to wrap our brains around, how is it that we grew so far apart from each other, that we were willing to kill each other by the hundreds of thousands. The estimates are anywhere from 675,000 to 750,000 Americans who
Yes.
died in the American Civil War. And how did we get to that point where we're literally killing each other over ideas like slavery, over what the future of our country should look like? Should it be free? Should it be open to slavery? And so So hopefully you're thinking of that. Let's get to the final stanza here. Ain't it cute to see a Yankee take such everlasting pains, all to get the devil's thanky helping on 'em weld their chains? Why, it's just as clear as figures, clear as one and one make two. Chaps that make black slaves, I'm gonna not say that word.
We're not gonna say
Yeah,
that.
want to make white slaves of you. And gosh, I think talk about a gut punch.
Yeah, that one. I think this is Ms. Lowell's not sugarcoating nothing on this one.
Absolutely not. It's as clear as figures, meaning
Hmm.
it is as plain and clear as math, clear
Hmm.
as one and one makes two. And this is a point that not only Lowell is making during this time, but other people are saying too. The institution of slavery not only obviously makes slaves of the African Americans, but it also makes white slave. It makes slaves of white Americans as well.
Hmm.
And so this is something, and I don't want to give away all the answers here. I want to let our students kind of think about this and kind of let that marinate a little bit, let that soak in. How is it that the institution of slavery also enslaves people, Americans who aren't slaves?
Hmm.
What was your thought on this final stanza, Mr. Hahn?
Well, like I said, Miss Lowell's not sugarcoating anything. What was it? I think my interpretation of the first half of the stanza is, "Ain't it cute to see a Yankee take such everlasting pains, all to get the devil's thanky helping them weld their chains." Well, Yankee, I'm not sure how they referred to the term Yankee at the time, but Yankee is usually a term referring to people who lived in the northern states, I
Mm-hmm.
believe.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
in the way that I read it, I thought, what was it? I thought it was a call out to those who are living in the north, and like calling them out, like those living in the north supporting this conflict, supporting this war. And it's like Mr. Lowell's pretty much saying that they're in league with the devil because they're supporting this war, because this war is for the proponent of slavery. So that's kind of how I figured on this one.
Yeah. Well,
Mm.
and again, it's definitely, and that's one of the, I think that's the final thought that I want to leave with our students is I want you to think about how when you have this war, how does it help to forward the institution of slavery? Number one, but then also the bigger question is how does this last line right here is the one that he
Mm.
really wants his readers, and I think mostly his audience is people in the north, people of the north of the northeast. He's looking at these probably mostly industrial states like Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Ohio, Illinois, and he's looking at them like, how can you possibly support this? How can you support this war, understanding, like, why can't you see what I see, which is that this war is basically helping further the institution of slavery.
Hmm.
And most importantly, just that last line, that this whole the slave power in the South wants to make white slaves of you, meaning ultimately we as Northerners, he's telling his fellow Northerners, we will be enslaved by the institution of slavery. So I want students to think about that.
Hmm.
Okay, well, Mr. Hahn, we could talk history till we're blue in the face because this is a fun thing to talk about. But I do want to limit it. I said the very funny thing to Mr. Hahn before we started recording. Hey, I think we should keep this to 5 minutes. I think it went a little bit more than 5 minutes, but I think we gave a very thorough treatment of the poem, and so hopefully we gave students a lot to think about.
Hmm.
And Mr. Hahn, any final thoughts before we stop the recording?
Not that I can think of in regards to the poem. I think we did like you said, a thorough job with the time allotted that we're aiming for. So I think we're good here.
Cool. Hey, if you are watching us at this point, thank you for sticking around to the very end, and good luck with your Mexican War primary sources. If you're watching this before Friday, just want to remind you that we're going to be on live. You get to chat with Mr. Hahn and Mr. Ippolito, 10:30 a.m. on Friday, April 3rd, and I think that's it. All right. Thanks, Mr.
Hmm.
Hahn.
Thank you, sir.
All right. See you guys soon. Bye-bye.